Judge William Harrison had been presiding over cases in the small-town courthouse for nearly 2 decades. His days followed a predictable rhythm. A stack of paperwork, a steady stream of defendants, and the ever-present hum of the courthouse's old ceiling fan. He prided himself on being a man of routine and fairness, a judge who dispensed justice without bias. His reputation in the community was built on a solid foundation of impartiality, or so he thought. That day was no different, until Dr. Evelyn Carter walked into his courtroom. At first glance, Dr. Carter appeared as calm and composed as any other defendant Harrison had encountered. She was a black woman in her early 40s, wearing a sharp, tailored suit that suggested she was someone with a purpose. She stood with an air of quiet confidence, not nervous like most people caught up in minor legal matters. Harrison didn't think much of it. He greeted her in his usual manner, ready to move through another case. It was the kind of day where everything seemed like business as usual. Dr. Carter's case was straightforward. A traffic violation. She had been caught running a red light while driving through town. No accidents, no injuries, just the kind of case that filled the court calendar without much fanfare. Harrison had seen it hundreds of times. Drivers who either weren't paying attention or simply couldn't stop in time. He didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. As Dr. Carter stood before him, Harrison noted her calm demeanor. Most people would be flustered in this situation, especially with a fine hanging over their head. But not Dr. Carter. She answered every question with precision, her voice steady, as though she had been through far more difficult situations than a traffic ticket. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize profusely or try to make excuses. She simply acknowledged the violation, accepted the procedure, and waited for the ruling. It was almost as if she were accustomed to being in control, even in a setting that could make the most seasoned person uneasy. Harrison made his decision quickly. He was efficient, as always. He read off the fine and set the due date for payment, hardly thinking twice. He didn't pause to consider anything beyond the facts of the case. After all, a traffic violation was a traffic violation, no exceptions. He handed Dr. Carter the paperwork, noting that she could appeal if she wished. But there was no sense of urgency in his words. Just another case wrapped up in a matter of minutes. As she turned to leave, Harrison felt a brief flicker of curiosity. There was something about Dr. Carter, something familiar, but he brushed it off. He had a full docket ahead of him. The day would move on, and Dr. Carter would become just another name in the courtroom's long history of traffic offenses. But little did he know, this would be the beginning of something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about fairness and judgment. As Dr. Carter left the courtroom, Judge Harrison went on to the next case, his mind quickly shifting back to the usual rhythm of his work. The courtroom continued its steady buzz of voices, lawyers making arguments, defendants listening anxiously to their fates, and the occasional shuffle of papers. But for some reason, Harrison couldn't quite shake the thought of Dr. Carter. It wasn't that she had done anything extraordinary. It was just her presence that lingered in his mind. There was something about the way she held herself that felt out of place in his courtroom. Most defendants, even those who were calm, seemed to show some hint of nervousness when faced with a fine or judgment. But not Dr. Carter. She was almost unnervingly composed, as though she were used to much higher stakes than a traffic violation. Her eyes had been clear and steady as she stood before him. No hint of defiance, no sign of discomfort. Harrison had seen many defendants over the years, and most had been much more reactive, perhaps defensive or apologetic. But Dr. Carter, she was in full control, like someone who had mastered the art of navigating even the most awkward of situations. Her quiet confidence had struck Harrison in a way he couldn't quite explain. He found himself replaying the brief exchange in his mind, searching for any clue as to why she felt so familiar. Maybe she was someone he'd met before, he thought. Perhaps a distant relative, or maybe someone in the community he had crossed paths with in a social or professional setting. But no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't place her. Her face was clean of any overt sign of recognition. And the name, Evelyn Carter, didn't ring any bells. The day continued on without incident. Harrison dealt with a handful of minor offenses, and as usual, he handed down his verdicts with efficiency. Yet every so often, his mind wandered back to Dr. Carter. Who was she really? And why couldn't he shake the feeling that there was more to her than just another traffic ticket? At the end of the day, when his assistant, Samantha, came to collect his case files, Harrison mentioned Dr. Carter's case casually. He described her as a composed, professional woman who didn't seem fazed by the situation. Samantha nodded, then paused before saying, "Do you know who she is?" Harrison furrowed his brow. "What do you mean?" "She's the U.S. Secretary of Energy, Dr. Evelyn Carter." The words hit him like a shockwave. His eyes widened in disbelief. He stared at Samantha for a moment, trying to process what she had just said. The woman who had stood before him, calm and collected, was not just anyone. She was one of the highest-ranking officials in the country, the Energy Secretary. The weight of that realization struck him hard. How had he missed it? The question lingered, unanswered, as Harrison sat there, stunned by the realization that the woman he had found wasn't just a random defendant. She was a national leader, and he had completely overlooked it. Judge Harrison sat in his office, staring at the paperwork in front of him. The words on the page blurred as he tried to come to terms with what his assistant, Samantha, had just revealed. Dr. Evelyn Carter, U.S. Secretary of Energy. How had he not recognized her? The realization made him feel uneasy, a sinking sensation growing in the pit of his stomach. He had judged Dr. Carter just like any other defendant. No different, no special consideration. And yet she wasn't just any ordinary person. She was a leader in the country, an influential figure shaping energy policy on a national scale. Harrison had never imagined that someone like her would appear in his courtroom for something as trivial as a traffic violation. The thought lingered in his mind all evening, eating away at him. His hands, usually steady when going over legal documents, now shook slightly as he flipped through the pages of cases still pending. He tried to focus, but Dr. Carter's composed face kept flashing before his eyes. He thought back to the brief interaction. The way she stood so poised, how she didn't argue or make excuses, just accepted the fine without hesitation. Was she used to being treated that way? Had this happened before? The more Harrison thought about it, the more he realized how little he had truly considered the people who walked into his courtroom. He had always prided himself on being fair, on treating everyone equally. But this was something different. He had made a snap judgment, one based solely on appearance and the situation in front of him, without ever wondering if there was more beneath the surface. And now he couldn't escape the nagging question. Was this the kind of unconscious bias that so many had warned about? The case had been closed, and the fine had been issued. That should have been the end of it, he thought. But the more he turned the events over in his mind, the less settled he felt. He hadn't just found a random woman. He had made a decision about someone based on superficial impressions, not on the whole picture. Was he just another cog in a system that treated people differently because of their appearances? It wasn't long before Harrison's unease turned into something else, an uncomfortable need to make it right. But how could he? What was the right move here? Should he call her? Apologize? Was that even enough? The thought of confronting Dr. Carter, the very person he had misjudged, felt daunting, but something told him that doing nothing was no longer an option. He spent the entire evening in deep reflection, asking himself how he could have been so blind. The day that had started so predictably was now forcing him to question everything he had stood for. Was he really the fair and unbiased judge he had always believed himself to be? The realization stung, but it also lit a spark. He needed to understand how he had let his assumptions shape his actions, and how to ensure that it never happened again. Judge Harrison's thoughts kept him awake long into the night. He paced around his office, unable to focus on anything but the growing realization that he had misjudged Dr. Evelyn Carter. He had grown accustomed to making decisions quickly, but now he questioned every step he'd taken in her case. Had he treated her differently from other defendants? Had he let his assumptions about who she was, or who he thought she was, guide his actions. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how easily he had overlooked the significance of her presence in his courtroom. The woman who stood before him wasn't just a person caught in a moment of everyday traffic violation. She was a leader, someone who shaped national policy, a woman with a voice that carried weight in Washington, D.C. Yet, in his mind, she had been just another name on his docket, a case to be processed with the same speed as any other. But what had made this situation even more troubling was that Harrison had assumed her story based on what he saw. The black woman in professional attire, calm and confident. Without even recognizing it, he had let his biases filter his perception. He thought he had treated her fairly, but in hindsight, it felt as though he had judged her more harshly, if only because he hadn't taken the time to truly see her. His mind raced with the possibilities. Had he been dismissive because of her gender or her race? Or was it simply that she didn't match the usual image of a typical defendant in his courtroom? He reached for his phone, half tempted to look up more about Dr. Carter, but the thought of Googling her felt intrusive, like it would be another attempt to reconcile his mistake without actually confronting it. What did he really hope to find? That she was who he thought she was. Or worse, confirmation that his assumptions were right all along. The reality was this: he didn't know her. He didn't know anything about her life, her struggles, or the path that had brought her to this point. What if he had judged her based solely on what was easy to see in the moment, her demeanor, her calmness, her professionalism, without questioning what those traits meant? In a way, it felt like a missed opportunity, not just for him, but for society as a whole. How many times had he, as a judge, made snap decisions about others because of their appearance, their background, or even their social status? He ran his hand through his hair, feeling the weight of the mistake settle on his shoulders. Dr. Carter's case had exposed something deep within him that he hadn't fully understood before, how even the most well-meaning people could harbor biases they didn't realize they had. This wasn't just about a traffic fine anymore. This was about understanding himself, about becoming better, about undoing the damage he had unknowingly caused. But how could he even begin to fix it? Would she forgive him for his ignorance? As his eyes lingered on the clock, ticking away the minutes of the long night, Harrison knew that this would not be the last time he asked himself these questions. He would have to make a choice, and soon, about how he could transform this mistake into something that mattered. The following morning, Judge Harrison found himself unable to shake the weight of the previous day. As he sat behind his desk, reviewing his schedule for the day, his thoughts kept drifting back to Dr. Evelyn Carter. He couldn't quite escape the feeling of discomfort that had settled in his chest. It wasn't just about the fine he had issued. It was about how he had failed to truly see her for who she was. But as much as he wanted to bury the incident and move forward, the world outside the courtroom had already begun to take notice. The news, initially a small blip on the local radar, soon spread like wildfire. By midday, the headlines were everywhere. Judge finds U.S. Energy Secretary without realizing who she is. The story had captured the public's attention, drawing a mixture of disbelief, amusement, and scrutiny. Harrison could hear the murmurs in the courthouse before he even arrived that morning. Colleagues whispered behind closed doors. A few even shot him knowing glances, their faces a mix of judgment and curiosity. The incident had quickly become a topic of conversation, not only in the legal community but among the public at large. The media outlets had picked up the story, spinning it into a piece about the complexities of power dynamics and implicit bias. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about the larger implications of how people, particularly those in positions of authority, treat others based on assumptions. Judge Harrison found himself growing more uncomfortable as the day wore on. At first, the story seemed harmless enough, just another amusing tale about a high-ranking official who had been caught in a minor indiscretion. But the commentary quickly shifted. The social media landscape exploded with people weighing in on the situation. Some mocked the judge for not recognizing Dr. Carter, while others criticized him for issuing a fine to someone so prominent. But among the noise, there were also more serious discussions about unconscious bias, race, and how people in power are often judged by a different standard. The backlash, while not entirely aimed at him, made Harrison feel exposed. It was clear that his actions had sparked a wider conversation about justice, fairness, and privilege. It wasn't just his courtroom that was under scrutiny. It was the system itself. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how little attention had been paid to the broader issue of bias within the justice system. Was this a sign that the system, at its core, was failing to truly see people for who they were? Or was it simply an isolated incident? Even as the story dominated the headlines, Dr. Carter remained silent. She had not released a statement, nor had she made any public comment about the fine or her interaction with Harrison. The public, eager to know how she would respond, had to wait. Meanwhile, Harrison struggled with the weight of his own role in what had quickly become a national conversation about race and power. His reputation, once built on consistency and fairness, now felt like it was at the mercy of public opinion. For the first time in his career, Harrison felt unsure. The certainty he had always felt in his judgments began to fade, replaced by an uncomfortable doubt that lingered. He knew that, for better or worse, his actions had sparked something much larger than a simple legal case. As the days passed, the buzz surrounding Judge Harrison's fine continued to swell. The media coverage intensified, and public opinion became more divided. Some people found the story humorous, mocking the fact that a judge had failed to recognize one of the most important figures in the federal government. Others, however, seized the opportunity to explore deeper issues about implicit bias and systemic inequalities. Online forums, news outlets, and even talk shows began to dissect Harrison's actions, with many questioning whether a traffic fine could be just the tip of a much larger iceberg. Harrison could feel the pressure mounting. Every moment seemed to carry weight. He tried to carry on with his usual routine, handling cases, meeting with colleagues, reviewing legal briefs, but his mind kept drifting back to Dr. Carter. He couldn't escape the overwhelming feeling that he had let a golden opportunity slip through his fingers, one that might have helped him grow as a judge and as a person. But how could he fix it now? The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the situation was about more than just the fine. It wasn't even about him or Dr. Carter at its core. It was about how assumptions could shape decisions and the ripple effect those decisions could have. He had an opportunity now, not just to apologize to Dr. Carter, but to use this moment to make a broader statement about fairness, awareness, and growth. He didn't want this mistake to define him or the way others viewed his integrity. So, after much reflection, Harrison made a decision. He would offer a public apology, not just to Dr. Carter, but to everyone who might have seen his actions as indicative of a larger problem in the legal system. It was a Friday afternoon when Harrison stood before the cameras for the brief press conference he had arranged. Reporters filled the small room, their cameras flashing, eager for the judge's response. With his heart beating fast, Harrison walked to the podium, prepared for the moment. He cleared his throat and spoke, his voice calm but sincere. "A few days ago, I made a mistake," he began. "In the course of my duties, I fined Dr. Evelyn Carter, a public servant of immense importance, without recognizing who she was or considering the larger implications of my actions. This was a failure on my part, a failure to see her for the person she truly is, and to judge her based on the facts of the case alone." He paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts before continuing. "I want to acknowledge that this mistake was not simply about missing someone's identity. It was about a much deeper issue, how assumptions and biases, even those we don't realize we hold, can shape our decisions. I failed to be as thoughtful and aware as I should have been." The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Harrison could feel the intensity of the moment, the eyes of the world watching him. He had no intention of trying to justify his actions. Instead, he focused on taking responsibility, hoping that his words might signal a step toward accountability. "I am committed to learning from this experience," he concluded, "not just for myself, but for the integrity of the legal system that I serve. I will work to ensure that I am more thoughtful, more aware, and more committed to fairness in every decision I make moving forward. This is not just a matter of correcting a mistake. It's about ensuring that such mistakes are not repeated, and that we all recognize the importance of seeing each person fully, without judgment based on assumptions. The apology, though brief, was heartfelt. Harrison knew it wouldn't erase the mistakes he had made or immediately heal the public's perception of him. But he hoped it would start a conversation, one about accountability, awareness, and the willingness to grow from one's errors. As the cameras clicked off and the reporters shuffled out, Harrison felt a sense of relief. It wasn't an easy decision to make, but it was the right one. And now, the next step would be waiting to see how Dr. Carter would respond. Would she accept his apology? Would this be the beginning of a new chapter for both of them, one that was defined by mutual understanding? Harrison didn't know yet, but he was ready to find out. For days after Judge Harrison's public apology, there was no word from Dr. Evelyn Carter. The media frenzy surrounding the story only seemed to escalate, with pundits and commentators discussing the broader implications of the situation. Some praised the judge's attempt to own his mistake, while others questioned whether it was too little, too late. The public awaited Dr. Carter's response, and Harrison found himself checking the news constantly, wondering how she would react. Would she accept his apology? Would she speak out against the entire situation, or choose to remain silent? On the 5th day after the press conference, Dr. Carter finally broke her silence. She issued a statement to the press, which was quickly picked up by every major news outlet. The words she chose carried weight, offering insight into her thoughts on the matter without adding fuel to the fire. While I certainly understand the attention this incident has garnered, I want to clarify that my goal is not to dwell on the mistake of one individual. Dr. Carter's statement read, "The actions of Judge Harrison were certainly an oversight, but they are not the defining issue here. What matters is how we move forward, how we address the biases that we all carry, and the steps we take to correct them." Harrison exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. Her words were measured and thoughtful, not accusatory or defensive. She wasn't seeking revenge or using her position to make him the scapegoat for larger societal issues. Instead, she was acknowledging the situation with a calm perspective that mirrored the way she had entered his courtroom days before. "I appreciate Judge Harrison's public apology," the statement continued. "It takes humility to admit when we have failed, and I respect his willingness to confront this situation head-on. We all make mistakes, and while none of us are perfect, what matters is how we grow from those mistakes. As a society, we must recognize that unconscious bias exists everywhere, and it is our responsibility to actively work to overcome it." The statement ended with a call for collective action. I encourage all of us to take this moment as an opportunity for learning and self-reflection. We must strive to create a more equitable world, one where every person is judged based on their actions and character, not their appearance or background. For Harrison, reading her words was like a weight lifting off his shoulders. It was clear that Dr. Carter had no intention of holding his mistake against him. She wasn't angry or bitter. Rather, she was offering a chance for reconciliation and growth. Her response was nothing short of gracious, far more than Harrison had expected. In the days that followed, the media began to shift its focus. The story no longer revolved around the fine or the initial mistake. Instead, the conversation turned to how Dr. Carter's measured response had set a tone for healing and dialogue. Public opinion, once divided, now leaned toward admiration for both Dr. Carter's grace and Harrison's accountability. As for Harrison, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. His mistake had led to an important conversation about bias, privilege, and fairness, but it had also shown him the power of humility and the potential for growth. He was still grappling with the consequences of his actions, but he knew that this was a pivotal moment in his life. With Dr. Carter's response, he saw a path forward, one that would require more self-awareness, more empathy, and a commitment to doing better, not just for himself, but for the people he served in his courtroom. The incident had shaken him, but it had also strengthened his resolve to ensure that such a mistake would never happen again. He had learned that true fairness wasn't just about the letter of the law. It was about understanding, humility, and a willingness to evolve. The weeks following Dr. Carter's statement and Judge Harrison's public apology felt like a whirlwind. The story, while no longer dominating headlines, continued to spark discussions in smaller circles, within legal communities, social justice forums, and even the halls of Congress. Harrison found himself deeply affected by the ongoing conversations about implicit bias and the role of the legal system in perpetuating inequalities. More than ever, he felt a responsibility to ensure that his actions were a reflection of the fairness he had always claimed to uphold. But the true shift for Harrison came not in the public reactions, but in his own internal transformation. The mistake he had made, though born from an unconscious bias, had opened his eyes to the complexities of the systems he had worked within for years. He had always prided himself on being a fair judge, someone who evaluated the law without prejudice. But now he realized how easy it was to fall into the trap of assumptions, how small decisions, even ones made in the course of a routine day, could be shaped by ingrained biases. Dr. Carter's graciousness and understanding had left an indelible mark on him. Rather than retreating from the situation, or choosing to escalate it into something personal, she had used her platform to bring attention to a broader issue, asking everyone to reflect on their own biases. Her approach was not about blame. It was about growth, both individual and societal. Harrison found himself inspired by her words and the way she handled the situation with such dignity. In many ways, it was a reminder that the path to a fairer world wasn't about condemning others, but about fostering an environment of learning and accountability. He took concrete steps to ensure that he didn't fall into the same traps again. He began attending workshops on implicit bias and diversity in the legal system, something he would have brushed off in the past as unnecessary. He started seeking out perspectives that challenged his own, listening to voices he had never fully considered before. Harrison knew that the work he was doing was far from finished, but he was no longer content to go through the motions. He wanted to be a judge who made a difference, not just in the decisions he handed down, but in the way he understood and treated everyone who entered his courtroom. The ripple effects of the incident continued to be felt. Conversations about bias, fairness, and accountability spread far beyond Harrison's courtroom, gaining traction in various institutions and organizations. His personal growth became an example of how mistakes, when acknowledged and learned from, could lead to meaningful change. As for Dr. Carter, her public response had only solidified her reputation as a leader of grace and wisdom. She continued her work as the Secretary of Energy, advocating for equitable energy policies and using her platform to promote positive change. Harrison had heard through various channels that she was pleased with how the matter had been handled, but her focus remained on the bigger picture, just as it had from the beginning. In the end, the fine, the apology, and the media storm had not been just about one man's misstep. It had been about the power of recognizing one's mistakes, taking responsibility, and using the opportunity to become better. Judge Harrison understood now that justice wasn't just about following the law. It was about seeing people fully, understanding them beyond their titles or appearances, and working to ensure fairness for all. And as he entered the courtroom each day, he carried with him the lessons learned from that pivotal moment, knowing that his journey toward true fairness had only just begun.